All right, welcome, folks, for something a little bit different today. When I originally set up the Substack that many people here, I think everyone is subscribed to, I put out an offer for free PDFs for people who want to get the paid upgrade, but also regular chat sessions, Ask Me Everything sessions, which due to my crazy schedule, I have not really gotten the chance to fulfill that promise. So since we had a cancellation of a speaker today, I figured, well, now would be an opportunity to appease my conscience and to do just that very thing that I offered all paid subscribers, as far as like a more intimate discussion process, which is going to be today. So I don't want people to think that, like usual, they have to necessarily raise their hands and wait in queue to necessarily ask me a question or to throw a thought based on something you've been wrestling with regarding some of the content that I've been publishing over the past few weeks or months. You know, feel free to do that. I did prepare something somewhat formal, and I know I marketed today's presentation with the subtext that we're going to go into the occult Nazism, and we can do that. But I was thinking, since Cynthia and I got back from Toronto and Calgary, we did 4 presentations. It was fun. And I've gotten messages back from people saying, "Hey, can you give me the recordings of all of your presentations?" And for the one that did get recorded, we happily sent it out. However, much of what we did was not recorded. The technical difficulties got completely out of control. So we put it out there, and it got kind of lost in the abyss. So, what I'm going to do today is go through some of the elements with a PowerPoint of what we did as far as why the Nazis didn't lose World War II and what to do about it. So I'm going to do that. And I think that should just spark some flow. There's going to be some allusions to the occult. I decided I'm not going to tackle it head on directly in this presentation, but we'll, if you want to go there, we can go there. So let me begin by doing a little bit of a screen share, and we'll get started. So somewhere here, there is a screen that I need to share. There it is. Got it. All right. I'm going to do full screen. Where's full screen? Can folks see a blank white screen right now? Good. All right. All right. So I'm going to try to pummel through this as efficiently as I can. Last month, keep in mind, it was the anniversary of 9/11 that happened on over 23 years ago. And important little kick in the ass of something to recollect that came with that. And that has a lot to do with the Reichstag fire. So the issue of false flags ruling a society in a state of fear, in a state of constant crisis, has been a technique used by empire for centuries, if not millennia. That was part of Nero's technique of lighting Rome on fire and then blaming it on these very pesky, disruptive groupings of Christians, who then were persecuted as a solution to the burning down of Rome under Nero. This didn't go away after Nero, right? What I have here on the left is a picture of the Reichstag burning down in February of 1933, as was discovered after the fact, although I would imagine it was probably knowable before the fact. This was entirely an SS-run operation from the inside that then blamed Jews and communists, which then justified, of course, the enabling acts. So, the solution to terrorism against Germany was give up your freedoms, give up your liberties, let the new chancellor give him dictatorial powers just to restore order temporarily. And the idea was never that it was going to be temporary. And if anybody had read the writings of Nazi crown jurist Carl Schmitt, they would have discovered that there was something called the unitary executive theory that Schmitt developed quite succinctly, that justified the idea of a unilateral leader acting kind of like a monarch, imposing their will without any checks and balances. But it only kind of works in a state of constant emergency. Otherwise, people don't just give up their liberties. They don't just reduce their standards of living willfully. It requires a state of terror to be the cultural climate that people live under. So when you look at the rise of the neocons, it's not just the thinking of Leo Strauss, which influenced the emergence of the neocons, or I should also say Leon Trotsky, which is another anomaly for many, hard right conservatives, is that they have to deal with this weird paradox that the founding fathers of their movement, whether it's James Burnham or Irving Kristol or it's a big list, are typically you'll find them also in the Trotsky camp. They were all leading Trotskyists. Burnham was the assistant, the American secretary to Trotsky before Trotsky was killed. The leading figures who set up Rand Corporation were Trotskyists. So again, not a coincidence that this would also give rise to this virulent ideology of neoconservatism that really took over under Zbigniew Brzezinski. He at least allowed this thing to become infused into power structures of government along with the Trilateral Commission. This is where people like Donald Rumsfeld, Richard Pearl, Dick Cheney were infused into governing stratas in Washington, with a very peculiar idea that they were all both formerly in their youth Trotskyists and also for the higher up neocons Straussians. That is, they believed in the thinking of a figure who was very closely tied to the Frankfurt School, Leo Strauss, who taught that there was a secret doctrine of Plato. So he called himself a Platonist, but unlike Plato, he actually said that there's a secret doctrine for the elite, and that everything Plato says about the need for a philosopher to love wisdom, love virtue, love the good, that's all for the stupid doctrine for the stupid people. But there's a secret doctrine of the secret Socrates, who Strauss taught his students, or his elite students, because he had, as Hadia Drury, one of his former students, pointed out, there were two Straussian schools. His favorites, maybe 1 out of 30 students who exhibited a certain je ne sais quoi, who would be brought into his inner office after class to get secret teachings, and then the 29 out of 30 who just got the surface appearance of what they thought he was teaching. And Strauss basically said, okay, if you want to know the real Plato, if you really want to know the real Socrates, you have to realize that Thrasymachos from book 1 of the Republic is Socrates. Socrates is Thrasymachos. And he said that's the key to understand how to interpret everything else in the Republic. And every Platonic dialogue is might makes right. The ability to punish your enemies and satisfy your lusts and friends is the real happiness and the real immortality of the true philosopher, who's strong enough to transcend the conventional morality. Or Callicles from the Gorgias dialogue, the student of Gorgias, who says the true good. He's courageous enough to say that the true good, capital G, is he who can have as many lusts and sensual desires and the power to satisfy them, even if they constantly grow through addiction, right? And in the dialogue of Gorgias, it's clear that Plato is making fun of this guy, because he's saying, well, basically, Callicles, you're pretty much saying that that the good in your view is like a water bucket with constantly more holes being put into the bucket where more water is pouring out, and it's just the power to replenish the water into the bucket ever more fast that defines the true happy good tyrant. And Callicles is like, yes, it is. Strauss says that's real Plato right there. That's the real true qualified leader. But since their views, their worldview is so disgusting that the majority popularly would never accept that, they have to masquerade their true beliefs under sophistry, right? This is the type of thing that says, oh, there's populism in the world. Orban, he's giving rise to populism, Trump populism. All that means is a type of leadership that doesn't want to, in their heart of hearts, kill their constituents. But they can't say it, right? So you get this. This is the thing that came in with the neocon real takeover, which, I mean, I've looked into it. It was knowable that this was going to happen. They were running war game exercises months and months before, even a full year before this happened, before 9/11 happened, basically preparing for these scenarios of planes flying into towers. One scenario that was run by the Pentagon involved planes flying into the Pentagon. And then what do? Another scenario involved bioweaponized smallpox that they said was going to be launched by Saddam Hussein in June of 2000. This was called Dark Winter, also being war gamed. So at the time, they didn't know which scenario they were going to play with. They ended up with the planes for now. But this was completely foreseeable. Lyndon LaRouche, an American economist, gave a live presentation in January of 2021, basically warning that looking at the configuration and the psychological profile of the new Straussians coming in with Dick Cheney, that you should expect another Reichstag fire. He gave this as a public lifetime announcement that people can listen to. So this was knowable that this was going to be the thing that they would do because they believed in the unitary executive theory of Carl Schmitt. That's part of what they did. And that's also what is behind the Heritage Foundation, the thing that's been trying to infiltrate the controls of the potential new administration of Donald Trump around Project 2025. It's entirely based on a philosophy of the unitary executive and this is good that that there are visible battle lines within Trump versus this other thing that's been trying to infiltrate and take control the way the exact same way the Heritage Foundation subverted Ronald Reagan in 1980, which is when they were first brought online in 1978. Was they were brought online in order to look and masquerade to accommodate the psychological profile of a conservative, typically Christian type of voter, and then bring the policies into something that would accommodate an empire mode of behavior and not something traditionally anti-imperial as the American traditions were up until the murder of JFK, by and large, though there have been problems, as people know. So I've got here this little thing here, a quote from Hermann Goering saying, "This is the beginning of the communist revolution. We must not wait a minute. We will show no mercy. Every communist official must be shot where he is found. Every communist deputy must this very day be strung up." So he took advantage. He didn't waste any time to miss that opportunity. And indeed, you did, coming out of the wake of that, did have not just, like I said, the enabling acts, but you had things like the pushing through undemocratically of Tiergarten 4, the medical reforms that were based on killing a lot of the useless eaters, people who were deemed mentally deficient or prone to low IQs or criminal behavior were killed, except the type of criminal behavior that was sanctioned by the high SS, of course. The other thing was the Night of the Long Knives. Many of Hitler's political opponents were murdered during that dense period of marauding massacres of paramilitary groups coming in, night raids, killing, again, everybody who was not going along with the new party plan, including people who were not communists even, but were just labeled so for expedient reasons to kill them. We've seen this as well as the basis for the Pinochet murders in Chile. Anybody who was a communist, right, could be thus disappeared easily overnight, assisted by the Green Berets, assisted by the CIA, as Cynthia Chung has done very good work going through the Condor, Operation Condor, and the entire Condor Tel information cybernetics network that the CIA and military industrial complex managed over the entirety of Panama, the Central America, South America, which put hard right pro-privatization leaders like Pinochet into power, like the figures who oversaw the overthrow of nationalist leaders in Brazil, like Goulart, who was overthrown. And then what did they do? Pinochet privatizes everything, opens up to the free markets, but kills everybody who might resist by just labeling them a one-size-fits-all communist, thus can be disappeared. So again, very, very common technique that's been used again and again. If you're a Russian right now, a Russian geopolitician looking at the world, you would see certain similarities, right? This is the growth of NATO as of 2022. Since then, we've got Finland and Sweden who have been made full members. There's new discussion currently. Mark Rutte really wants to get not NATO headquarters operational in Ukraine, as if this is somehow going to reduce the chances of military hot war with Russia. Insane. Zelensky's peace proposal that he just put forth, which the current foreign minister of Hungary just said is a recipe plan for World War III, calls for an accelerated joining of Ukraine. Obviously, there's certain people behind the scenes pushing back against this, but at the same time, there is a flight forward murder-suicide mechanism in play as well, psychologically. That's a factor. So Russia has seen this thing grow from 15 countries in the mid-90s when NATO was technically defunct to over 30 countries today, with an idea of also expanding on the Eastern Front. Eastern Front of Russia. And here I'm referring to the NATO of the Pacific, which is still being pushed hard. The current mayor of Seoul has become a champion for stationing nuclear missiles into South Korea, which already hosts 28,000 US troops that didn't leave after the Korean War. They stayed there. Japan, 58,000 troops. They've already changed their pacifist constitution some years back to permit for a war in defense of allies. With, of course, who are those allies and what is the nature of this war? That's obviously left unsaid within their new constitution. But obviously in Japan, you're seeing also, just like in Ukraine, a revival of a romanticization of certain people, certain forces who are on the wrong side of World War II, who are being seen like heroes, like Bandera, or in the case of Japan, you have many Japanese fascists who are also being celebrated. In Canada, there's currently a petition to take down the new World War II memorial against victims of Stalin. And the petition makes the point that 300 of the over 500 names on this memorial, and I believe it's in Ottawa, are Nazis who were killed, during World War II because they were Nazis, right? But no, these are actually victims of Stalin. And it's not Victory Day anymore. In Europe, it's Europe Day. And, so you've got a revisionism of history, which is going on faster and faster. And a lot of people don't realize that this is only accelerating. So this is what the Russians, I think, are being reminded of. Going back a little bit in time, every Russian has family who died in World War II. 28 million Russians died in that fight against the Nazi Wehrmacht. They took on over 90% of the pain of the Nazi war machine. 90% of it was taken on by the Russians. The Chinese also have a much more vibrant memory of what this is, because in World War II, they lost 10 million people against another Wall Street, London-sponsored war machine called the fascist Nazi regime of the emperor. So that was also another pseudo-Aryan Ubermenschen, ideology that was catered for the Japanese psyche to convince them that they're descended from a higher stock, a different race than the lower Sino races of the mainland China and Korea, which is why the vanguard of the Japanese fascists had no problem treating people like they were animals, dissecting them, doing live vivisection. This is what Shiro Ishii was doing with Unit 731. Live vivisections of people after being given weaponized anthrax, smallpox, other things that they wanted to see in what ways the body deteriorates. And similar things were being done by Mengele and other Nazi scientists too, because they had a view that they were indoctrinated into, that they're descended from a different species, a Hyperborean species that's different from the Darwinian monkeys that other species on Earth came out of. This is the higher root race, right? That the fifth Aryan root race is going to give rise to the sixth root race of the new age, the new transhuman age, which was the promise of the occult Nazi high elite. That was the promise of the new age of Horus, the new age, the 1,000-year Reich. That would be the promise after a purgative period of pain, of violence. The Japanese had similar ideologies that were also catered to them through different theosophical networks that were embedded within Japan through the Shinto religion, which was being cultivated and groomed, or at least a variation of it. There was like an esoteric version of it that was also being pushed, as we had also in Tibet, as we had also in India, with different variations of Aryanism being infused into the Indian elites, who were induced in some cases, whether they were mostly Hindus, but there were others, in some cases there were Buddhists of Tibet, who were induced to create alliances with the Nazis. In the case of Tibet, it didn't really have to happen in the same way as in India, because Tibet was still under a feudalistic system where 30% of 95% of the population was illiterate and had a life expectancy of only 31 years of age under the system of the monks and of the Dalai Lama, which basically was a whole society. It was a slave society. Again, average life expectancy 31 years of age, but the Nazis were going there for a reason. They had a whole cosmology and a whole different kind of anthropology that they were trying to find the roots of this Hyperborean civilization that moved through Atlantis, and it gets weirder and weirder. We could talk about that in the Q&A. Anyway, so this is what the Russians are seeing. They're seeing the growth of Nazi Germany that effectively won World War II. Germany had won World War II by 1940. They took everything. Alex Krainer did a wonderful trilogy of essays, and he gave us a presentation on the British back-channel diplomacy, British intrigue behind the growth of the Nazi war machine from the standpoint of how they took over Austria, how they took over Czechoslovakia, how they took over Poland, how they took over France even. A lot of this was made possible through the nefarious Iagos of the British intelligence diplomacy faction that was ensuring that this thing was going to rule at the same time as you had something growing up inside of Britain. So this was done. The only thing that stopped this from happening was largely, again, Russia deciding, no, this is not the type of system that they're going to allow. And they fought like hell. So there's something going on historically that we're a lot of people are missing. The other thing I'll just showcase, I mentioned it, but just to get a visual of it, I know many people have seen this, but this is a full spectrum holistic policy by the empire that is spreading chaos in every place that they can. In the heartland, they've been doing it. They've got, obviously the Israeli time bomb has been sparked. There's a bunch of Gordian knots there. Taiwan's being pushed for a separatist movement by the US that's been groomed now for quite some time. Ukraine, all of these things. So it's one full spectrum policy to try to come out with a threat to intimidate Russia, China, Iran, and other countries to just give up their sovereignty, go back to 1993, pretend that the last 30 years didn't happen, get under the same, house that's going to be demolished, and accept a one world government based on a depopulation ethos. That's like the threat implicitly behind the military maneuvers that you see on the screen here. In Canada, which is where I'm based, and many people here are based, there's been a something under the radar in advance of a policy that Jean Chrétien, our interesting. I think he's a fun guy. One of the last relatively interesting prime ministers we ever had, who rejected, along with his second in command later on, they rejected the pressures by Dick Cheney to install a ballistic missile shield in the Canadian Arctic in 2004 and 2005. It became political suicide to try to talk about that since then, but the objective never went away. And now we've got a new Arctic strategy that's been pushed through, which does call for finally accepting long-range ballistic missiles in the Canadian Arctic. And that's something which I haven't seen any major media outlet in Canada talk about in any cogent way. That's why we made our documentary on the Arctic just recently, was to try to bring people's attention to this. And, again, I just mentioned Finland, Sweden are full members. Well, what does that mean? Now, Finland and Sweden are not as dangerous as Ukraine, obviously, but there are still issues that have been unresolved since World War II. Looking at the screen right now, what we're seeing are something that bothered me when I first saw this, which up until 2020, between 1919 and 2020, this for a century was the Finland icon for their Air Force, which always kind of surprised me, and people would say, oh, it has nothing to do with Nazism. Their swastika was made a year before the Nazi Party was even created. No connection at all. Look the other way, please. Now, the reality is, no. The reason why the Nazis ended up getting or selecting the swastika, which came out of the theosophical agency that was trying to create a new synthetic religious order based on the sort of stew of elements of different religions of the world, but the worst elements of different religions of the world, with an outer and an inner teaching order. Again, very Straussian, right? Very an exoteric and an esoteric structure for the inner elites and the outer plebes who are not initiated. So that was one of the symbols of the Theosophists, was this Eastern symbol. The Nazis picked it up largely through Hermann Goering, who was the personal pilot after World War I to a figure who was a high level, I think it was, I'm mixing up my von Rosens, but one of the three von Rosens of Sweden. Von Rosen was also the leader of the National Socialist Party of Sweden. He had a big castle, which was a organized an occult center of the Nordic revival of paganism of Europe. And Hermann Goering was so in love with the images of the personal logo of the von Rosen family that they selected for themselves, is that he said, I love it so much, I want to make it my logo. And got that inspiration when he came back and made his case why the swastika should be the moniker. The von Rosens donated their one of their planes to the Finnish, to early Finland, that had been fighting its own war with Russia, or the Soviet Union. And that plane was decorated with the swastika. And because it was the first plane donated by the von Rosens, leading Nazi National Socialists, working very closely in Sweden with the Nazis. That's the reason why Sweden was making 80% of the Nazi ball bearings, was through the von Rosen operation, which was very much tied to Wall Street, which had a huge operation in New York. That's a big reason. It was through the von Rosen, very elite, high up family. It goes back many, many centuries, if not millennia. So this gives us a direct tie-in. This is everything to do with the thing that created Nazism. Is the same thing that put the swastika on the Finnish Air Force, which again only retired this thing in 2020. So there are unresolved things. There are Karl von Mannerheim, right? The chief of essentially the head of Finland. He ran the military, ran the political governance of Finland. During the 1930s, 1940s, who was a very close admirer. He was a strong admirer of Nazism and had a view of East Karelia, Greater Finland, which is something like 18 times bigger than the current boundaries of Finland, which he believes was the natural divine right of the great genetic stock of Finnish, who are not Slavs, they're not Vikings. There's something else that are tied to a Hyperborean Atlantean civilization. They all have the same variations on the theme, basically, is what I'm trying to say. But that's one of the things that Finland was doing when they were allied with the Nazis in World War II. And that was never properly resolved, even though Sweden was typically neutral. No, they were still providing their territory for Operation Barbarossa, for the Nazis to invade Ukraine, utilizing Swedish infrastructure and land, and a lot more. So again, things have been unresolved. We've seen a lot of Nazi imagery making a comeback. This is actually, the swastika has been blurred out of this one, but this is one of many famous images of the Azov Battalion of Ukraine, which has the black sun of the occult, Himmler's sign, which was tied to the Viking ruin in Norse mythos. Also, you had, anyway, I'm not going to go into a tangent there, but you have a lot of Nazi symbolism that has come back with the Azovs, with the Pravi sector, with the C-14 paramilitary groups in Ukraine, which are very neo-Nazi, and they work with American neo-Nazis. There's an overlap. There's been actually a lot of evidence that American neo-Nazis since 2013 have been sent in to, cut their teeth fighting in Ukraine, and then, are brought back into the Americas. They seem to have a certain amount of FBI protection, as we found with the figure of, I forget now. Well, there's a number of neo-Nazi organizations that we've done deep dives in our videos and our essays, have been given CSIS in Canada and FBI government protection, intelligence protection. Caleb, I forgot his name. Oh, well, the head actually was discovered in the 90s, that the head of the Canadian Heritage Front, the only real neo-Nazi organization in Canada at the time, was a CSIS agent, Grant, I'm forgetting his name, but this was actually something discovered, and we brought this into one of our recent documentaries. So there's an advantage. Now, these are people all in Ukraine at the time, and we see here, again, direct swastikas, black sons of the occults on the Azov Battalion, on their different clothing. The SS Death's Head insignia, which is also tied to the Templars as well, which the Templars are the origins of the skull and crossbones That's something a lot of people don't know. They were a mercenary pirate force also on sea, not just on the land overseeing the Crusades, but the Templars had control of many of the ports of Spain during the Crusades, of Italy. Those ports were needed not just for illicit like trafficking of material, but also for sustaining vast flows of troops that would be sent to and from the Middle East during the 200 plus years of Crusades. So that involved a control over a lot of the shipping. So the use of pirates also as a proxy for geopolitical controls was used back then in the medieval ages as well. So skull and crossbones was not just a fun thing we've seen in Hollywood movies. This has some weirder origins, which also should reshape how we think of the Nazis using it. This is Alfred Heusinger, Hitler's chief of staff in 1944, became NATO's chairman in 1961. People who've read Cynthia Chung's Empire in Which the Black Sun Never Set already know all of this already, but it's worth just running through ever so briefly. He wasn't alone. You had Hans Spiegel, in fact, 8 high-level unreconstructed Nazis became the heads of the Central and Eastern NATO European Command from 1956 to 1983. Hans Spiegel was the Nazi field marshal and Erwin Rommel's chief of staff, who became commander-in-chief of NATO forces from 57 to 63 in Central Europe. Johannes Steinhoff, famous Nazi fighter pilot for German Luftwaffe, became chairman of NATO military committee from 71 to 74. I'm not going to read them all, but you had, again, it's a big list. And these are just some of the more notable ones. There's a lot more. And this, as Cynthia goes through, had a name of NATO's secret armies. The Italian aspect of it was named Operation Gladio, which went public in 1992 when a prime minister named Andreotti gave a speech to the Italian parliament admitting that indeed, yes, there are NATO secret armies in every country of Europe that have been staffed and maintained by unreconstructed fascists, but it's okay because it's all justified at the end of the day because, we're fighting communism and that means everything is justified. Reinhard Gehlen, the head of Nazi intelligence, killer. What a killer. This guy was given a new job as the founder of the West German intelligence from 47 to 68. It got a new name from the Bundeswehr in the 50s, but basically that's what he did. And it wasn't him alone who was given this new job. It was Stefan Bandera. I'll say something about him, but it was his entire Gehlen organization that he had built up from the 30s onward throughout World War II of hard killers who got their street cred really like wiping out villages, interfacing with different Nazi agencies in different nations. It was hyper paramilitary, and the whole thing was brought into NATO and brought in especially to West Germany to shape the controls of the free and liberal Western order against communism, which again was never resolved. In 1968, this guy had this job for 20 plus years. The Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. I already alluded to this, but Stefan Bandera on the right, Mykola Lebed on the left. 2 leaders, one representing OUNB, the other one OUNA. 2 pseudo-rival, but ultimately 2 complementary fascist organizations that believed in the Übermenschen ideology of a hereditary elite, racially superior, spiritually superior, to rule over a eugenically unfit, depopulated slave society. That's what they saw for Russia, as it was supposed to be the slave colony of Untermenschen Slavs that would be extractive only. Same thing for the Chinese. They were supposed to be the Untermenschen, dirty Sino Untermenschen, who would be the slave colony for the superior Japanese super beings. You had also, so again, the Organization for Ukrainian Nationalists. Bandera was given a job after World War II with Gehlen in West Germany until he was killed by a Russian operative from the KGB. And I can't say that was a bad idea. What you have there is a flag that Chrystia Freeland got in a certain amount of controversy for proudly waving at a recent Freedom for Ukraine rally. The Slav Ukrainian with the black, the black and red OUN flag was what she was holding proudly. She later on erased this photograph when it went viral and was an embarrassment, and then ultimately put up a version of it that didn't have her holding the flag. But she did. She knows exactly what this thing represents. There's no claim for ignorance on this one. Again, it's blood and soil. It's actually held upside down because the blood and the black is supposed to represent the black soil of Ukraine, the red, the blood of the heroes. And together, this is yet another blood and soil cult that they're trying to turn into a perverse form of nationalism, the type of nationalism that is conducive to global empire. Same thing that they've been doing with the blood and soil ideology that they were infusing over a century into the political Zionist ideologues who ended up gaining ever more control over the structures of power in Israel. At right, you have Christia also there with a picture of her grandfather at a Nazi party, Mikhail Shomiak, who is the editor-in-chief of the Kravitsky Visti newspaper of Ukraine, which is a newspaper that was the official Nazi voice in Ukraine, pushing out Hitler propaganda, rallying up Jews, Slavs, other Untermenschen for mass extermination. So he was brought into Canada after World War II, and that's Christia's, her grandfather, who she's just so proud of. Keep in mind the contrast, right? Because I always encourage people to, I've been using a method, and I think it works quite well, of analysis that looks for always irony. I'm looking for contrasts. I'm trying to invert things, right? So where you're looking for the drama. The point is that this stuff wouldn't have happened had you already have had the success of the first effort at a new world order back in 1919 as a solution pushed by the Roundtable movement and the other oligarchs of the black nobility that had still been centered in England, the biggest one world government of the time, to orchestrate World War I. So those same people who orchestrated World War I were also pushing the solution of a post-national League of Nations world order with a eugenics religion for the elites to manage the depopulated, dirty masses. So that didn't succeed. Had that succeeded, it is my contention that they would not have needed to push on their other scenario of a more aggressive Mussolini, Hitler, National Socialist solution to pummel the world into accepting what they should have accepted, some believed, in 1919. And again, you had Lincoln Republicans, McKinley Republicans organizing around the figure of Warren Harding after Woodrow Wilson was ousted. And Woodrow Wilson was a complete shill, pro-eugenics, skull and bones type puppet of Princeton, who was a puppet leader, just like Theodore Roosevelt, both pro-eugenics, both expanded the revival of the KKK, which should have been annihilated after the Civil War, but both grew in leaps and bounds. Both had an esoteric, occult, central operating management system about it, an ideology, which followed the same ideology of that held by Albert Pike, the founder of the modern KKK in 1865, of a world of revived pagan mystery cults masquerading as perhaps Christian for the sake of controlling the masses, but in reality being a very, very dark inner core of high priests that would represent the worst aspects of the thing that was overthrown with the emergence of Christianity. So this is what Albert Pike, that's his religion. That's part of what he represented with when he was running the Scottish Rite and reorganizing it in after the Civil War. This is what was being revived under Teddy Roosevelt, under Woodrow Wilson. This is why you had a lot of these same imperialists of the Fabian groupings organizing and controlling so much of Woodrow Wilson's policies. And then the only thing that stopped that was Warren Harding, who was a real McKinley Republican, who said, no, we're not going to give up our sovereignty to a supranational government under the covenant of the League of Nations. And there was a fight. There was a fight in Russia around different factions that had different visions of what they thought communism meant, of what they thought the Bolshevik Revolution was. Many of those factions were tied to Western intelligence. There were certain individuals who were patriots, who had a better sense of the cultural fight that went back centuries, who organized around the figure of Stalin at the time. And here I'm referring to people like Vladimir Vernadsky, but there were others who had a living memory of what the nature of the real fight was, who were able to say no. They had the wits to say no to the League of Nations back then. Same thing in China. You had people around Sun Yat-sen who said no to the League of Nations. And in Germany as well, in the early 20s. You had people like von Lautenbach, who was an advisor to the foreign minister who got assassinated in 23, whose name I'm forgetting, Walter Rathenau, who had a different idea of creating a like a Lincoln style political economic policy with a win-win cooperation orientation with Russia based on building infrastructure together, erasing the Versailles Treaty debts that were unpayable. So instead of just printing money in Germany, the idea was to build industry and to create infrastructure and to create real wealth that would give the collapsed German mark value once more, because it was going to participate now in a productive process instead of that which the victors of World War I preferred, which was just destroy their physical economy, destroy their agro-industrial base, take over the North Silesia and the Ruhr, just take it all, take all of Germany's means of producing real wealth, and then tell them to pay this money. Of course, it's gonna become hyperinflationary, and I'll say something about that later. So you had a fight that stopped this attempt from happening. That's part of the drama. A lot of these people who fought got killed. They were willing to die to preserve humanity against this other death cult. It again, 1933, another attempt under a League of Nations London Finance and Economics Conference of 33 that ran for 6 months. That was supposed to provide a solution to the Great Depression that had hit the world. And the solution was one world government. Nations shouldn't be allowed to control their own credit anymore, because that's what causes Great Depressions. Not JP Morgan speculating with other people's money and creating bubbles where there should have been a viable economy. Not that. It's really just the idea of nations that are the problem. And the only reason why that failed was because you had Franklin Roosevelt, who pulled out the entire US delegation from the 65 nation conference. And without the US support, it was worthless. And as was stated at the time, FDR torpedoed that conference, which was supposed to be the second attempt at a new world order based on a eugenics religion for the elite, which later became rebranded, as we know, as transhumanism after World War II, because eugenics had a bad name. 1944, that was the more aggressive attempt at another world government. It peaked at a battle at Bretton Woods between the British Imperial faction, represented then by John Maynard Keynes, a treasurer of the Eugenics Society, a lifelong member, a proponent of depopulation of one world government under his Boncour, in opposition to the American faction that resisted empire, that saw that as an antithetical to the US raison d'etre. Ultimately, that faction were labeled, as people know, after World War II, red commies and purged from any type of position of influence. Henry Wallace, Harry Hopkins, some of them died. Others were just torn away from any type of influence in academia and government, in military, because, again, easy answer, if you're an enemy of the oligarchy, you're a commie and thus can be taken down. FDR said, they who seek to establish systems of government based on the regimentation of all human beings by a handful of individual rulers call this a new order. It is not new, and it is not order. For those who want to dig in more deeply, I'd say read volume 2 of The Clash of the Two Americas. The story is told in much more detail. And it wasn't just in America that you had a pro-Nazi agency. And keep in mind here, this is the man who was the King of England, the pro-Nazi king, at Edward VIII, with Wallace Simpson. And he was the guy writing to Hitler saying, keep on bombing the Brits. They will give in to reason. And once that happens and they submit to your peace offerings that might take a little bit of hard love, I will be there to be your Nazi king once more. And there's letters that have been uncovered of him writing these things to the Nazis when he was in exile in Portugal, as well as in South America afterwards. Neville Chamberlain, right, the great appeaser, also meeting there with both Hitler and Goering and Mussolini. Alex Craner's essays on this are impeccable. They're fantastic. This is Edward VIII teaching young Elizabeth II how to do the Hitler-Nazi salute, since this is going to be the thing ruling the world, so she might as well learn now how this works. The fact that Hitler did want a peace deal with the Americans and especially the British is true, Daryl Cooper, who was on Tucker Carlson, is not lying when he says this. He's only lying when he says that them accepting the Nazi offers for peace would have been a better thing than fighting the Nazis, which is what Tucker is currently pushing and nudging his audience into that worldview that sees that World War II should not have happened because we all should have had an alliance with the Nazis. So there's obviously something ignoring the fact that the Nazis actually were imperial and that they were not happy with their borders. Their idea was always to use Russia as a slave colony as part of a evil version of multipolarity, right? Of local empires sanctioned, run by fascist leaders, managed by a banking elite at the top. That's what the New World Order was as an idea. Everyone was going to have their own jurisdiction, right? Japan was going to have their own jurisdiction of Asia, and Italy was going to have their jurisdiction of a big chunk of Africa and a certain amount of the Americas. But the Anglo-Americans were going to have their jurisdiction. India was going to be under the control of the British. The Anglo-Americans of London and Wall Street were going to have control of the Americas by and large, and that was the way the world was going to be run. Under this different trilateral thing. This is actually one of the reasons why the Trilateral Commission was given the name it was based on a rehabilitation of this idea of a Western European empire, a North American empire that would control a big chunk of the world, and then a Japanese empire. So Japan, Europe, and Washington being three poles. Of course, above these poles would still be the same banking elite and mystery cults that would always be there managing this thing from the top. Montague Norman, figure who was the longest running Bank of England governor and a mentor in many ways of Hjalmar Schacht, the Reichsminister under Nazi Germany. Hjalmar Schacht was the guy who came in with the solution for the hyperinflation, the controlled demolition of the German economy by introducing Rentenmarks, brand new Rentenmarks that would be given to people who would bring in their wheelbarrows full of Reichsmarks that were useless. They lost all value, and my grandma still has a big box full of these, or a few of these $50 million Reichsmarks that are useless. Maybe they're collector's items now, from that period from her grandmother. So these are just pictures of kids playing with stacks of money. And again, the solution was always so that the crisis was created in order to provide for that solution, which would be associated with new behavior, a lowering of expectations of living standards with the new economic architecture, but at least you get some stability for once, right? You can feed your starving kids for the first time in months. And a lot of people went along with that. They were spiritually pulverized and acceptant of the new terms of conditions. In America, this was also going on, right? I mean, if you think about it, in 1934, which is where this photograph, this is a photograph taken at Madison Square Gardens, New York, at one of dozens of Nazi rallies that were held at Madison Square Garden between 1933 and 1940, right until the U.S. went into the war. Actually, this is still going on. With pictures of George Washington next to the Nazi regalia and a bunch of American fascists. There's different flavors of it. There were Nazi youth camps, hundreds of Nazi youth camps all across North America. That was a big thing, preparing the next generation to be the vanguard of the new American Aryanism that would deal with the problems of the Jews. Everyone was reading the Protocols of Zion pamphlets that Henry Ford was publishing into English that had been going on already for some years before that. Aleister Crowley's networks were very heavy with this. People like George Sylvester Virek, who is the American poet, aristocrat, really father of modern conspiracy theories, if you ask me. He wrote sort of the first expositions of the Federal Reserve and Jacob Schiff and Warburg as a Jewish Freemasonic takeover of America through his Strangest of Friendships, Wilson and E. Mandelhouse book in 1932. He's the guy who trained Eustace Mullins as well. David Irving. There's so many early, I guess you could say, influential thinkers who have shaped so much of the alternative media, alternative history world that's become very popular now, that people aren't believing the mainstream garbage. They're jumping onto alternatives, but those alternatives themselves are in many cases full of toxicity and Satanism. As George Sylvester Drake was himself a Satanist, who wrote satanic poetry regarding human sacrifice. And anyway, it gets bloody. And I cite some of this in my Occult Tesla series. He's actually one of the best friends of Nikola Tesla. Anyway, I'm saying all of this just to get across that this was big culturally in the Congress, in the Senate. There were all sorts of political parties pushing this stuff. Here's a zoomed out vision of a 1939 Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden. 20,000 people attended. The American Bund was there overseeing it. It had vast sponsorship from banking entities as well, that were the same entities that were pushing for the murder of Franklin Roosevelt, right? A lot of these banking entities were supporting and sponsoring the rise of fascism. FDR had 2 assassination attempts, keep that in mind, in 1933 February, and again in 1934 under Butler, who blew the whistle, and I'm going to show a video. Prescott Bush worked for 2 banks, Brown Brothers Harriman, where he supplied money through Brown Brothers Harriman. It was actually a Montague Norman bank that had a merger in 1930 with the Harriman family. The Averill Harriman had their own banking dynasty, and so they merged the Montague Norman Bank of England dynasty with the Harriman dynasty to create Brown Brothers Harriman. That became a conduit for vast amounts of very low interest loans to the Nazi Party that Prescott Bush was a director of. Later on, he was the director of another bank that was found guilty for trading with the enemy in 1942 after America had entered World War I, and he was still providing vast support for the Nazis, and he was found guilty. Should have been in jail, but instead he was simply made a senator. The American Nazis that were tied to the DuPonts, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, definitely, but a lot of these leading American blue blood establishment operations also had seeded something called Time, Life, and Fortune magazines under this figure of Henry Luce, who had put Mussolini on Time magazine covers at least 13 times, probably more. I think Mussolini held the record for the most appearances on the cover of Time Life. And in his Time magazine would often use it as a propaganda tool to convince Americans that fascism is a perfect fit for America. And it makes the trains run on time and all this stuff. So there was an idea that your suffering of the Great Depression can finally end if you just give up the Constitution, ideas of liberty for all this stuff. They don't work in the modern age of industrialism. Get a new type of system, and whether it's corporate fascism or a Vichy fascism, it could be any type of flavor, but it can't be the old way of doing things where people were supposed to have free speech and the right to just say what they want and do what they want. No. That's not compatible with the new age of order. No. Smedley Butler, why not? Let's just do a stop share for those. I think everyone's probably seen Smedley Butler's famous speech, but for the sake of the composition, I'm going to just infuse it into this presentation now, which is Smedley Butler's blowing the whistle on the fascist takeover of America. And he recorded himself in 1936, broadcast to theaters all across America, to radio stations, warning Americans of what was going on, what he was brought into. So let's just play this right now.
I appeared before the Congressional Committee, the highest representation of the American people, under subpoena to tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship. The plan as outlined to me was to form an organization of veterans, to use as a bluff, or as a club at least, to intimidate the government and break down our democratic institutions. The upshot of the whole thing was that I was supposed to lead an organization of 500,000 men, which would be able to take over the functions of government. I talked with an investigator for this committee who came to me with a subpoena on Sunday, November 18th. He told me they had unearthed evidence linking my name with several such veteran organizations. As it then seemed to me to be getting serious, I felt it was my duty to tell all I knew of such activities to this committee. My main interest in all this is to preserve our democratic institution. I want to retain the right to vote, the right to speak freely, and the right to write. If we maintain these basic principles, our democracy is safe. No dictatorship can exist with suffrage, freedom of speech and press.
Well, that's still relevant. Let me just hit, how do I stop this share?
President Anderson, members.
Sorry, I'm just having trouble with the stop share. Here it is. Okay. So yeah, that's still extremely, probably more relevant even now than it was when he said that in 1936. I just noticed that Alex Craner's presentation has been shared in the chat box. That's great. Everybody should save that link. Super important presentation in the chat box. Let's get back to the presentation here. Yeah, so Smedley Butler just wasn't your average soldier. He was the most decorated general in U.S. history. He had the love of the all soldiers, and there were still 500,000 legionnaires at the time that he gave that speech who were on strike because they didn't get their bonus pay because there was a Great Depression. So, you know, it's a tough time. But they were people who were set up. You know, they were well-trained soldiers. And the idea, as he said, was to take this 500,000 strong man army and storm the White House, install him as a puppet dictator. And he blew the whistle. He took names, right? He got a lot of names, and that saved us a lot of time, and it saved Roosevelt a lot of time to carry out his war on Wall Street, his breaking up of the banks, the Glass-Steagall reforms, the creation of the Pecora Commission, the New Deal positive reforms of the vast national credit. It emanated through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which controlled, I think it was 50% of all loans by the middle of World War II were emitted, of currency in circulation was directly tied to loans of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. It had been able to rein in control of the Federal Reserve and have it for the first time behave in a certain degree in accordance with national objectives by putting his own man, forcing his own man, Marinette Eccles, to be the chair of it. Never happened before or since. But you know, there was something that Lincoln had done, that McKinley had done, that was part of the U.S. constitutional banking heritage that FDR had studied, understood, and applied, but not by himself. He had an alliance of people from both parties who were working together with a common understanding of the nature of the enemy, and that's very important. That this stuff doesn't happen by like a Hollywood movie with a Superman figure. There's always human beings organize, for good or for bad. We're the species that organizes around ideas. Other species don't do that. They organize around herd qualities, but not around concepts, right, that are based on reason. So for good or for bad. So that's just something to be reminded of. I'll show a couple more slides here to round it out. In Britain, it wasn't just the king. You know, you had Lloyd George, who was gearing up to be the prime minister a second time, who was also a pro-Nazi prime minister, one of the co-founders of the Balfour Accords that gave rise to the state of Israel earlier on, along with people like Lord Milner, who was another roundtable movement leader of Cecil Rhodes's faction. Sir Oswald Mosley, who himself was a part of the Theosophists, who ran the British Union of Fascists, and was a Fabian as well. He was actually, despite his hard stance, his not so gradualistic worldview, he was still a close associate with many leading Fabians. But he's the one who was leading the Nazi Party of Britain, of which there were several. There were several similar Nazi parties with different flavors in Britain. He was just probably the most loudest. So you had that factor. I didn't mention, I won't mention this right now, but in Quebec, in Quebec, you had the blue shirts. So Mosley ran the black shirts of Britain, the blue shirts of Quebec, which was the Quebec Nazi Adrien Arcand had a massive movement in Montreal, Quebec, all around the province, representing a eugenics solution to the Great Depression. A lot of it was based upon immigrants and Jews who were the new hate objects for a beaten down American and Canadian population that was suffering. They were ready to find an object to hate, and it was given to them through those pushing the protocols of Zion forgeries and those pushing a lot of this propaganda saying, hey, we got the perfect thing to hate for you. And it manifested in some really, really crazy ways. On the federal level, well, here, this is, they were all eugenics. I've said this word many times. It's basically a pseudoscience based upon statistics that was generated by Darwin's cousin, Sir Francis Galton, who generated this pseudoscience, which Darwin himself said he became a convert and a disciple of Galton in a personal letter to Galton. So it was basically Galton's objective was to socialize the logical consequences of Darwin's worldview in the lower domains of the biosphere and apply that logic of survival of the fittest in a world of diminishing returns to the human domain, which could then be applied self-consciously by figures who have intentions to use it as a science to purify and make the race better, to do what nature does unconsciously, but to now do it consciously. This is, I think, if people want to know the roots of transhumanism, they need to look at a mixture of Galton's views of eugenics and Blavatsky's neo-Darwinian synthesis, which were both occurring around the exact same time, from the late 1870s, and just growing as a weird, perverse set of considerations or interpretations of what is life, why is life, what is man, what is woman, what are the laws of the universe. So they had a very specific interpretation of what all of these things were that would be conducive to a system ultimately of global feudalism. Here's just some propaganda pictures of various eugenics things. Canada had Alberta, BC both pass eugenics laws in 1930 and 33. The US, I mentioned, after McKinley died, they were able to get Theodore Roosevelt, a big promoter of eugenics, who gave a massive amount of sponsorship to these things. He was very closely interfacing with the Rockefeller Foundation, that was also the Carnegie Foundation, both brought online in 1908, 1909, to promote a new type of science, a new type of medicine, a new type of idea of making society better. Indiana was the first to pass mass sterilization laws in 1907 under this policy, and it grew to 30 US states by 1933, which were then used by Hitler, including the Canadian provinces, to model his Tiergarten for Nazi health reforms around. So that was already, he modeled what he was doing on what we were already doing from the 1907 onward. Important that also to hold in mind. There was an ecological aspect of the Nazis too that people often overlook, but there was a decent book written not that long ago called How Green Were the Nazis? What you have there is a bird's eye view, a helicopter view of the Black Forest, featuring something the Nazis planted, these special yellow pine trees that were positioned in a very specific kind of way that are still there, as it's sort of testament to the nature worship of the Nazis, who came out of the Wundervogel movement. So, you had something in Germany in 1910, 1911, which were known as the Wundervogels, the back to nature, sort of pseudo hippies. They were also seeded from Ascona in the Esalen, Monte Verita in Ascona, which was sort of an anarchist, new age, theosophical, Freemasonic hub in Switzerland, which had great inroads into Germany. That was a big part of the Wundervogel movement. A lot of the leaders would actually go to Ascona for their orgies, different drug trances, different types of, attempts to unify Eastern mysticism with Western Gnosticism into some weird hybrid, and things like the Eranos conferences that Carl Jung managed. Carl Jung was actually a big leader at Ascona, as was Otto Gross. Aldous Huxley, his brother Julian, were frequent visitors. The leading vanguard of the New Age were all there. Eranos conferences that were set up in 1933, mostly by a bunch of pro-Nazi mystics around Carl Jung, was directly in Ascona. And this is what gave rise to the Esalen Institute as the American branch of Ascona. Already, you had something baked into Bohemian Grove as another earlier American branch of this thing, set up in the early or late 1890s. So yeah, you had this. Hermann Goering was the vice minister of conservation. They had a whole policy of eugenics for plants, that foreign plants that were unfit of the Aryan stock of natural indigenous ecosystem plants of Germany were extracted and destroyed to bring back a pure, pristine, natural German foliage. It wasn't just cleaning out the human riffraff its low pollution of sub races. It was also applied to plants. I don't know about livestock, but maybe. General Hiroishi, Unit 731, I mentioned that. He also was not punished at Nuremberg. He wasn't punished at all. He, in fact, got a new job with his entire unit in Fort Detrick, Maryland, where they were assigned to set up the biological warfare department of the U.S. military-industrial complex that Eisenhower was warning about later on. This was put to work in the Korean War. It was put to work testing out weaponized anthrax, all sorts of things in the Vietnam War, and in, I would say, every single war since then. So Hiroishi is actually the godfather in many ways of the U.S. bioweapons programs, of which last thing I've seen identified, the Chinese came out identifying about 320 international outside of U.S. borders biolabs, not just in Ukraine and Georgia, of which there are at least 40 in either country, or there were 40 in Ukraine, but in South Korea, all over China's perimeter, all over South America, in Panama, in Africa. That's big. It's a big thing, and it's all opaque as sin. Like, try to get a sense of this. And a lot of this grew out of not just Hiroishi's work, but was amplified after 9/11 due to the anthrax attacks. Another inside job, as we've discovered, and a Canadian professor, Gray McQueen, did a great series of books exposing. I interviewed Gray McQueen before he died, exposing the inside job that was the weaponized anthrax letter scares of September 18th up until December 2001, which were all done by the U.S. military-industrial complex. They threw one of their useful idiots under the bus to blame him as a closet Wahhabi American. But no, what was the consequence, though, was Cheney could then justify a $50 billion BioShield Act that amplified an already bad global bioweapons infrastructure many-fold over. I think a lot of this is very much on the radar of the Russians and the Chinese today. So just to wind it down, I've got a few more slides here left. Oh, yeah. Not only were these unreconstructed Nazis, Italian fascists, French fascists, many of whom were given safe haven in Quebec after World War II. Yeah, so Jenny's eyes just like popped open there. The leading higher ups amongst the black nobility, the higher inbred families of Europe that were always behind the rise of a global feudalism, the restoration of feudalism under the term fascism, went to work again. The leading Nazi SS officer, Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, was the founder of the Bilderberger Group in 1954, which became an annual elite, very secretive organizing committee that prepared the groundwork for creating a new type of capitalism that would be based upon like a weaponized capitalism, not one that would be based upon the creation of capital or entrepreneurialism, but rather by the idea of globalization, of mergers and acquisitions of banks and corporations that would have leaders positioned, that would be put through intelligence agency brainwashing or special elite educations in Princeton or Oxford or Cambridge, and then positioned to be in charge of these various corporations, who would then work to undermine the existence of sovereign nation states that would be taken down internally with what the Straussian neocons were pushing, which was that if you want to be a conservative, you have to push massive Austrian school deregulation, right? The nation should have no role to play in passing regulation, protectionism, nothing that could otherwise, no national banking. That's against conservative Christian values. Good conservative Christians know that we have to be followers of the elite Austrian school of the Habsburg Empire, which was basically just retweaking Adam Smith's imperial doctrines for the Habsburg Empire in the 1880s, which was the idea that nations shouldn't play a role in economic affairs, either protecting their people or doing anything for a positive idea for the future, building infrastructure. That's bad. So the more that happened, especially this got really bad in the 70s and in the age of Thatcherism, Reaganomics, where you had this Heritage Foundation operation increasingly gain hold, we in the Western world shut down our sentinels. We got rid of all of those things that would have forced these bankers to go to jail for gambling with other people's money, for doing things like junk bond trading, or from having these massive mergers and acquisitions, which would otherwise have broken trust laws. So this is part of what the Bilderberger Group was organizing towards, and frequent members involved now King Charles III, who's been a frequent member, the now dead, possibly reincarnated into a deadly virus. Prince Philip was also a major promoter and attendee of the Bilderberger events. I would say, again, the murders of the Kennedys was a big one, of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. There's a lot of murders of Enrico Mattei in Italy, but anybody who had a different idea of like a moral, conventional Christian society based upon helping the other, avoiding wars, leaping over the limits to growth by investments into scientific and technological progress, all of those people were eliminated, and the ideas that they represented had to be attacked with this idea that, no, the new ethos is that scientific and technological progress destroy nature. So every time human beings try to solve problems, we make things worse for nature. And so the new ethos must be protect nature from human beings trying to do things like end hunger or whatever. And so that's what came in over the dead bodies of the Kennedys, and the institutions that were seated to do that involved things like the Lord Rothschild Inter Alpha Group, created in January of 71, basically major private banks, Societe Generale, UBS, various major banks, private, that were seated in different European governments would be centralized under the Inter Alpha Group for better command and control. The same month, the World Economic Forum is founded by Maurice Strong and Klaus Schwab. Klaus Schwab saw Maurice Strong as his mentor, and Maurice Strong is credited as a co-founder and a lifelong director before he died. Kissinger was also Klaus Schwab's other teacher at a CIA-funded Harvard International Business School in 1966, who found a certain talent in this Schwabian kid with weird Nazi family connections. Johnny Vedmore did a good deep dive on the Nazi family roots of the Schwabs. Later that year, the US dollar is floated. Kissinger and Schultz orchestrate that. Now all of a sudden it becomes hedonism, is the new name of what is economic value, is what do the markets demand? What do speculators want to pay for a thing, for the price of a commodity, for the price of a currency? It's no longer, is the currency tied to productive activity in the real world that can be measured? No. The new logic post-floating of the US dollar became, do people want it? If they want it, how much do they think it's going to be worth on the spot markets or the futures markets in the next 5 seconds or the next, 5 months? And then gamble accordingly. You can even take out insurance on your gamble. You can take out derivative contracts. And those things became increasingly deliberalized or liberalized to become increasingly the economy. And that was done in a concentrated way from the early 80s onwards, is the liberalization of derivatives, the securitization of debts, either junk bonds or outright different kinds of debts, student debts, corporate debts, national debts, whatever, and then calling it a security in a bank, and then taking out insurance on those, and then gambling on the prices of the insurance of the stocks, right? So there just became infinite amounts of things. It's like a bad mathematical nightmarish fantasy where you could keep on creating new entities that don't really exist in the real world, that people can be trained to believe is the source of value. And then they don't notice that the derivative contracts became something like 40 times more in nominal asset or nominal value than the world GDP, which is only $80 trillion. And they say, as conservative estimates hold about 1.2 to 1.6 quadrillion dollars today of nominal derivative assets built into the Western banking system. It's not the same thing for Russia and China, but it's very much concentrated in North America and Europe. And as I mentioned, the Trilateral Commission was there the whole time, even before it was called that. Kissinger, David Rockefeller, Zbigniew Brzezinski had already been preparing the groundwork for this new trilateral reorganization of the world, with one center of command being in Japan, one in Western Europe, one in North America, and that would be sort of the infrastructure around which the new system, the new fascist world system, was supposed to be organized, as Zbigniew Brzezinski lays out in great detail in his Between Two Ages, America and the Technotronic Era, which is a very important book that people can read online. Maybe not so much anymore because archive.org has been shut down for the past week. I don't know if it's coming back again. probably won't. That's why I collect books. Side note, the Jacob Rothschild stated in 1983, gave a meeting, and I believe it was a trilateral meeting, where he said two broad types of giant institutions, the worldwide financial services company and the international commercial bank with a global trading competence, may converge to form the ultimate all-powerful, many-headed financial conglomerate. He's talking about basically getting rid of Glass-Steagall, getting rid of all of the laws from Europe and Canada that had formerly banned speculators from gambling with people's savings or commercial banking. That's part of what was done by Roosevelt to rein in the banks, was to break them up and to make it illegal to gamble with people's savings or to be a commercial bank and do investment banking. You couldn't do that. So that's what he basically says. We have to get rid of these walls so that we can have a multi-headed financial conglomerate, which is exactly what is done in the Big Bang of Thatcher in 86, in the destruction of the Canadian Four Pillars in 86, of the Bill Clinton destruction of Glass-Steagall in 1999. Is the creation of too big to fail banks. That's the consequence of getting rid of those boundaries. Is you create banks that become so big that if they fail, they take the world down with them, so they can hold a metaphorical gun to the heads of nations to bail them out whenever, or bail them in, as we now see the stage being set to transform people's savings that are in the bank into stock of the bank that they can't get out. That's the other way to bail in or bail out that they've been planning for the whole time. This is just a picture of the current an estimation of derivatives in 2007, which is probably about half of what it is today. So that's just the exposure of these derivatives. JP Morgan itself is exposed to more than the world GDP. This is the time bomb. This is the time bomb they built into the economy. It can be solved, but people have to be aware of what is the cancer, what is the time bomb, right? If you become intellectually aware of how to discern what it is, you can do the sort of thing that was done in 1933 under Ferdinand Pecora, the Pecora Commissions, who was an ally of Franklin Roosevelt, who was able to audit the banks, shut down the insolvent banks, force them to, show what are real assets in the real world and what are fake assets that can't be paid, and so they won't be paid. You have to hit the delete button on a lot of these claimed nominal assets that are going to blow up in our faces. The real economy, again, this is just one sampling. There's different ways of looking at this. Lyndon LaRouche, I really recommend people study his works on economics, on physical economics as a science, very important analysis. But he was already talking about this decades ago. And he had a point that, look, you can measure the rate of physical loss of production of agro-industrial goods and cutting edge investments into R&D, which are vital to leap outside of the limits to growth as part of just the natural human process of interfacing with the universe. You can look at the destruction of the physical reality that we've been living in over the past 50 years consecutively, at the same time as you can map out the growth of the services economy, financial services, other services that are non-productive, and the growth of the monetary flow or the currency in circulation year to year, and realize that it's growing at an unlawful rate because it should grow. You should have more currency one year to the next in circulation. That's not a bad thing if it's justified by the physical increase of the productive powers of labor, the way it was understood by Abraham Lincoln or Henry C. Carey or Franklin Roosevelt, right? If you have that understanding, it's okay. It's anti-inflationary, in fact, as Alexander Hamilton wrote concisely in his reports on manufacturers in a national bank and his reports on credit in 1791. There's anti-inflationary good debt, anti-inflationary good forms of credit. Then there's the hyperinflationary forms, which are this that we're looking at, that we've been living under. Last slide. So why do they hate Putin? What is Putin representing? I'll just say it quickly. Speech from 2021, he makes a point, his view on sovereign nation states. He says, only sovereign nation states can effectively respond to the challenges of the times and the demands of the citizens. Accordingly, any effective international order should take into account the interests and capabilities of the state and proceed on that basis, and not try to prove that they should not exist. Furthermore, it is impossible to impose anything on anyone, be it the principles underlying the socio-political structure or values that someone, for their own reasons, has called universal. After all, it is clear that when a real crisis strikes, there is only one universal value left, and that is human life, which each state decides for itself how best to protect based on its abilities, culture, and traditions. So, word from the adult in the room. So I wanted to just end with a word from the adult in the room, Putin. That's the end of my presentation. And like I said, I promised a discussion on the occult roots of fascism, and we can do that. I've alluded to it, or we could just talk about anything I've talked about, or whatever you have in mind. Frankly.